So this review is for The Art of Fable Legends. This is a video game art book, and it's very interesting because it came out a few months before the game was supposed to be released. And then, unfortunately, the game was cancelled. So even though that's pretty bad news for the game and fans of the Fable franchise, but what's really cool is that at least we have this 192-page art book for a game that, at this stage, may never be released, which is very unheard of and very cool, because if you can't have the game, at least you can have this art book. And so if you're not familiar with the Fable games, this book is going to be entirely fantasy artwork. I've never played them. I was more of a PlayStation man myself, and the Fable games were Microsoft exclusives, but I have seen it played a bunch and kept up with the development of the franchise because I think it has the look of a really great, unique fantasy world. And it's sort of been disappointing because there hasn't been any book that has either captured the art or the explored the world of the Fable franchise. So even though there haven't been any art books for any of the Fable games before this one, Fable 1, 2, and 3 had limited edition strategy guides that each had pretty good art sections in them. So these first sections really focus on the characters and do include a lot of final renders, which usually in art books would really annoy me, but because this game hasn't been released, we won't really get to see those or be as familiar, so it actually is really nice to see those in this book in this instance. And there is a bit of text, but it's just the usual sort of design fluff. So I'll read this section about the character Winter, just to give you some sort of idea about what the body text is about. Albion is a land of many parts, and Fabled Legends looks to explore the characteristics of each region through its characters. What we're trying to get across in this version of Albion is that the magic is more prevalent, says Eccleberry. In Fable 3, it was getting to the industrial and the magical. In the south, in Albion, the magic's confined to the woods, and that's where the Fae folk live. The magic's a dangerous thing, so there's mistrust. Obviously, the alchemist is selling useful potions, so we'll let them hang around. But the general thing is a mistrust of magic. In the north, it's the opposite. Magic is commonplace. Winter is a will user from the north, and the northeast actually. She doesn't feel cold. She is the cold. And all her abilities are about snow and ice. Her outfits are less about being refined, but more going back to a Celtic look. The outfits of whatever skins they can find decorated with woad, shell, beads, wood, and whatever else. So it's slightly more primitive. Winter is one of the core cast created at the start of Fable Legends development. Her goal with her powers, in the game terms, isn't to do damage, but to freeze and control crowds. Where she comes from, some mountains off to the northeast. Whether she was cursed or came from lineage or her dad was a bloke down the street with really cold hands, we don't know how she got those powers. She plays it differently from the others. She can do some damage, but her principal job is to reduce the amount of incoming threat towards her friends. So again, if the game had have come out, we would know all that stuff, and it would be, sort of useless fluff, but because it hasn't, that's now really interesting to indulge in. This has been such a bizarre book to review because it's not actually necessarily a great book at all. It would be the sort that I would usually give a pretty low review for, but because the game hasn't come out, it has actually made this book really, really good because the information doesn't feel repetitive, the design works don't feel boring, everything is kind of fresh and new and much more imaginative. And so it's really bizarre how a book that regularly, had the game come out, wouldn't be that great, is now turned into a great book by the fact that the game hasn't come out. Which may sound really weird, but it's absolutely true. So like with the text that I just read about the character of Winter, that information where they're just talking about her role is in the game, if you had played the game, you would already know that and understand all that stuff. But hearing them talk about it in this book without the ability to play the game or become familiar with it is really interesting to sort of understanding the characters in the world and what could have been. And even without the game coming out, the one thing that I think this book still does suffer from is not enough variety. And so as you can see from what we've gone through, it's all very sort of stock standard in terms of like the layout and presentation of the art, and also the actual artworks themselves, very standard looking fantasy artwork that I don't find especially impressive or noteworthy, which is what I was expecting from the game, which is what I have actually seen in concept art for the earlier games. And it's always hard to know with these sort of books if that's because the art direction for the game was not particularly great and there wasn't a great selection to choose from, or if they've just chosen a poor selection to include in the book. And as you go through the book, you get the impression that it's just a lot of the same. It's kind of a little bit boring. Like I've said, made much more interesting by the fact that the game hasn't come out, but otherwise it is, you've seen this type of stuff in fantasy art books before, and the book itself then doesn't do anything extra to make it particularly memorable. So it hasn't really, there's nothing in here as I go through that makes me really feel like, oh, this is the world of Fable. It hasn't really lived up to what my expectation of the world and the vision of these games is, which is a shame, because I think the Fable universe is really unique and funny and charming and a great addition to numerous fantasy worlds we have in fiction. So the fact that this is really one of the only books there is that sort of explains or indulges in any aspect of this universe is kind of a little disappointing. I think ultimately what I really would have loved, either from this book or some other book, is more of one of those sort of like world books where it's more discussing the lore and the story and the characters and things like that, and exploring the world as a fictitious book, not necessarily just being an art book. I think that could have been a lot more fun. And so I feel like with almost every book review I do, it's kind of hard to tell whether I'm saying this is good or bad. It's kind of a mixed review. But I will say, even though I'm not particularly impressed with it as in and of itself as a book, I think the fact that, as I've now mentioned a zillion times, the game hasn't come out means that this book is actually worth your time and money if you're a fan of Fable especially, but even if you're just a fan of fantasy art, fantasy worlds, because this is not, they're not going to reprint any further editions of this, so this is really, a really unique opportunity to own a part of this franchise and a very unique art book in the world of video game art books, to be able to see designs and characters and things like that that no one is, at this stage at least, ever going to play. So at the end of the day, I am very glad to have it. People of Albion. One of my favorite things about the world of Fable, as someone who wasn't that familiar with it, was that in the concept design and pictures and other things I'd seen for the people of the world of Albion, the NPCs, was they always had this real great sense of humor about them, and are really funny, which is something you rarely ever see in fantasy at all. Something that doesn't take itself too seriously, has a sense of humor. Usually fantasy is always sort of very dark and brooding and serious. So as an outsider, the people of Albion were definitely one of the things I found sort of most appealing and interesting. And so imagine how disappointed I was at this section. Look, ready? That's it. 4 NPC designs. And then it goes on to locations. That was it. I mean, so usually I prefer character design to environment design, but in this book it was actually the opposite. I was pretty bored with the designs of the characters, but then when you get into this environment section, the section on locations, it's actually really, really good. It's definitely my favorite part of this book. I feel like this section was much better at capturing the feel of the Fable world. And also it's just like really cool fantasy art to look at. And so now I'll just read a little bit about this section on the location of Rosewood. Rosewood, which lies to the south of Albion, is one of the land's largest woods and one of the most luscious environments. It's here that the fantasy world of Fable gets to stretch its legs. To me, there are great fantasy worlds out there, whether it's Middle-earth or Skyrim, says Eccleberry. The thing that makes Albion unique is that it's a place I'd actually like to visit. It's not dark and dreary. It's not somewhere where everyone's dying all the time. It's a fun place, a funny place. It has such an anachronistic sensibility to it at times. It has such a quintessentially British sense of humour that I, being one of the few Americans here, don't always understand, but it's usually amusing to me, even if I have to ask someone to explain a joke. And so see, that's what I was really talking about with the idea of this being sort of a unique, funny world, you know. But I just like how it pairs the comedy with also not being silly in a way, you know. It's not like Discworld or something. This isn't, and it's not, you know, like it's not aimed at being, you know, silly for kids or something like that. It is sort of a proper fantasy world. It just has sort of some, you know, very humorous, funny aspects to it that make it a little bit lighter, a little more fun. And so I really do hope that even though we may never get to see this game, I do really hope that this franchise will continue, because I think it's very unique and very cool, and this book is a pretty fun and unique way to indulge in that. Also, there was a limited edition version of this book. It had like a slipcover and an art print or something like that, but like almost every limited edition art book, it's certainly not worth paying the extra money, in my opinion.